I'm co-founder at Cloudability, and today I'm going to be talking about reserved instances. So both the science of saving with them, how to be more efficient with your spending, and also the cultural aspect of how to get them working effectively within your company. So Cloudability is a platform that basically helps companies who run on AWS and other clouds get better visibility into their spending, be more efficient as they scale, and save money. And so it's through my work at Cloudability and with our team's work that we've had the opportunity to really be along for the ride with the cloud journey with a lot of Amazon's biggest users, folks like these guys, folks like GE and Autodesk, who through the process of working with them through building and growing on AWS, we've really been able to glean a lot of best practices from them and share best practices between our customers. And that's really kind of the basis of what we're going to be talking about today is working with the $2 billion of cloud spending that we've managed for these types of folks, how we've seen them be effective at RIs and sometimes not effective as well. So quick level setting to get started. Show of hands, how many of you have purchased RIs before? All right, now keep your hands up. How many have purchased them more than once? Dozens of RIs? Hundreds? Thousands? One person? I was hoping for one. All right, so it's a good mix. That's generally about what I expect. For those of you who have done a lot of RI purchasing, the story you're going to see in here will probably have some familiarity. For those of you who have not done much at all, there's going to be some pitfalls you definitely want to pay attention to and hopefully avoid. Just check one thing here. So the story I wanted to tell you essentially is the story of an RI purchase that went really badly. And given that we're in Vegas, I thought I should call this story the RI hangover. Because it's really about a surprising turn of events after an RI purchase. And if anybody hasn't seen the movie The Hangover, it's about a bunch of friends who come to Vegas for their bachelor party, and they have this wild night where suddenly they wake up the next morning and they're surrounded by all types of bad things in their hotel room, and they can't remember what happened. They don't know how they got there, and they try and spend the whole movie basically unraveling how they ended up where they were. So the main character in this story is actually a Fortune 500 company who made a big RI purchase, and you can kind of guess where this is going from the title. But let's start with how this company, and we'll call this company Acme Corp, came to be buying RIs. And this trend here is one that you may recognize if you have been growing on cloud for a while. This is a story of their growth in cloud. So the y-axis is essentially how much they're spending a month, and the x-axis is dollars. So they started, as most people do, with some dev and test on cloud. And it was great. It was kind of like in the movie, the first drink of the night. They felt great. They got a little buzz on. This was awesome. Amazon lets you get the servers you want right away. We don't have to wait for them to be provisioned. Good stuff. So after that, they had a little involuntary load test where they essentially spun up a bunch of servers and forgot to turn them off and spent a lot more than they meant to. That wasn't so great, but they got it under control and moved on from there. So a little bit down the road, they got their first POC in place. It went well, and they were excited. This looked like it was going to be a great thing. So they continued forward, and they launched first apps into production. Not long after that, more and more apps followed suit, and this was amazing for them because suddenly they weren't bound by long schedules to get hardware. They were launching things as quickly as they needed. They didn't have to wait for hardware. The cloud was great. It was all thumbs up. Until they finally woke up one day with a splitting headache because this happened. The exec team started to really care about the bill. They had crossed this invisible threshold where it really started to matter. And for this company in particular, Acme Corp, they got an email one morning from one of their VPs, and he was furious. He was like, this thing is out of control. We got to get this in line. What are you guys going to do about it? And they started running around. They had meetings. They had email threads going back and forth. And the first thing they thought of was, well, let's turn off a bunch of servers, right? Because it's cloud. We got the elasticity component. If we're not using the servers, we don't have to pay for them. We might as well shut them down. And they started to look into that and realized they were going to have to take a lot of work to do the analysis, and they were going to have to pull in engineering resources and ops resources, and they had a bunch of things going on. We don't have time for that. So I thought, okay, well, let's size down instances. Let's get rid of those 8 extra larges, and let's go to some 2 extra larges. Again, we can't really put engineering resources into that right now. So they thought RIs, because RIs are great. You don't need to have any engineering or ops resources touch the infrastructure. You just write a check, and your bill goes down. And that seemed great. And they had seen some graphs that look kind of like this. This is from a webinar that we did earlier this year with Adobe and Amazon on RI buying. And Adobe showed that they had saved 60% off their EC2 bill by buying RIs. And in fact, they bought 3-year RIs and had a pretty significant savings. And so this was the answer for this company. They said, awesome, let's just go buy RIs. This will solve our problem. So they tasked one of their DevOps people to go do an analysis. He went off and did it. They bought some RIs, and they were done. And it became this. It's high fives all around. We did it. We got the RIs. And this wasn't a small company, right? They didn't buy a few RIs. This is a Fortune 500 with a giant spend. They bought tons of RIs. They bought 7 figures of all upfront RIs. Big cash outlay. This was going to put a huge dent in their spending, right? This was solving the problem. So they all, enjoyed a round of drinks, some high fives, and they went back to business. The next month, we saw this happen. The bill continued to go up after the 7-figure purchase. And they woke up again the next morning to an email from their VP, even more upset than he was before about what happened. They'd just spent all this money. How is it possible that the bill went up? And they're sitting there scratching their heads because they're like, we remember doing the analysis. We remember placing the order. We remember the high fives. How did we end up here? So that's what I want to unravel a little bit in this talk is what went wrong for them and how you guys, if you haven't run into these pitfalls, can avoid them as well. So the 3 big areas, and we'll dig into more detail on each of these, the 3 big things they did was first they involved the wrong people. Specifically, they didn't involve all the right stakeholders they needed, all the business stakeholders. Second, they used the wrong data. So they didn't use the actual billing data, which is what the RIs are actually based upon. And third, they looked at the wrong time frame. So they didn't look at what they were actually currently using. They looked at future plans. So digging into the first one, the wrong people, would love to get another show of hands. Who do you think should be responsible or drive that RI purchase? Engineering? Okay. I know you. I'm not surprised by that. Ops? Okay. Product owners, business owners? Okay. Finance, procurement, money org? All right. So you're kind of all right. Everybody's got a say in this for a lot of different reasons. And if you were to simplify this into 2 groups, specifically you've got the first 2, which are kind of fall under a tech org. Second 2 fall into a business org. We'll call them for a broad term. They all have an involvement to play in this process. And what happened with these guys, the first thing where they got stuck was it was just a single DevOps person who went off and did the analysis and made the purchase. And with RIs, there's definitely a technology decision to make. Like you need to understand what you're going to use, what you're going to be running in your infrastructure, and what that's going to look like. But there's also a financial one. In this case, and actually in general, you need the tech team to commit to basically using a certain amount of a type of instance, at least until the break-even point. So when you buy RIs, there's usually a 4 to 6 month break-even point. Could be 2, could be 8 months, depending on the type. But you need to know you're going to be running things after that point, and ideally considerably after that point, so you can start saving money. On the other side of the house, though, the business also has to commit to spending a certain amount of money for that project. And importantly, they need to decide how they want to deploy the capital. So do they want to put all the money up right now with an all upfront RI buy? Or do they want to pay over time with a partial or a no upfront? And that's really a decision about how they're going to pay for that rate. So in this case, and this wasn't the biggest mistake, but they bought all upfront RIs, and that both increased the cash outlay, which made the financial org actually be very, I wouldn't say upset is the word, they were surprised when they saw it hit. They didn't have heads up on this coming. And also the all upfront RIs, because you pay for the entire thing at once, all the hours are allocated at once, you lose the ability intra-month to find out what you're wasting. So I'll go into more detail on that a little bit later. But the key takeaway there with those is that you can't actually see month to month what is being unused. So the second big area, and this is probably the most important area where they went wrong, was they didn't use billing data for the RI planning. Now, RIs are a billing construct. This may seem obvious, but the name is really confusing. A lot of people get caught up on this. They're not a technology, right? You're not buying an instance, or you're not buying a specific instance or RI for an instance. You're literally just buying a coupon to get a better rate for an instance. It's the coupon you're buying, not the instance. So the tech team at Acme Corp knew they were running RHEL. I mean, they knew it. They're running Red Hat, absolutely no questions. They knew the infrastructure cold. Problem was they had brought their own licenses to the boxes. So Amazon was not billing them for RHEL, Amazon was billing them for plain vanilla Linux. Now, what this meant was when the bill hit, all these RHEL RIs they bought, which was most of the RIs they purchased, they weren't applied. On top of that, all of the vanilla Linux boxes that they were actually running were running on on-demand rates, which are obviously more expensive than reserved. So the third thing they did is they bought based on future plans, not their actual spending habits. RIs are applied each and every hour. Amazon cycles through your infrastructure. They look for a box that matches the coupon, and they apply it. And they can be changed really rapidly as your infrastructure changes. In this case, the tech team had expected to move from M3s to C3s in a few weeks. This big change is about to happen. Let's buy the C3s, because when we get there, we'll have the savings in place. The issue was, as things happen, there was a delay. They were delayed by several months, and that meant during that entire time, all those C3 reservations that they bought weren't being used. 7 figures just sitting there. And they couldn't actually report on the waste either because of the RI purchase type they made, the all up front. On top of that, again, you had all the M3s that were actually running on demand. So you see how this starts to stack up into a very, very bad thing. So on the topic of the purchasing as you need it, cloud's really built for just-in-time. Just-in-time purchasing, if you recognize this graph, it was on the Amazon homepage, I think, for a couple of years. And it basically outlines, why cloud has some advantages over data centers. With the data center world, you need to buy ahead of capacity. I know I'm going to need this much capacity, so I'm going to get servers in place months ahead of time. Versus cloud, you just spin up what you need as you need it. Everybody kind of gets this intuitively. I mean, it's the 4th year of reInvent. It's huge. Everybody knows about Amazon. This makes sense. But they don't apply it to RIs as much. And RIs are actually just about the same. You can buy them very rapidly. There's an API for it. You can provision them quickly. And you want to follow the same process of what are we using right now? Let's make sure that's covered, rather than, I think we're going to be doing this stuff next month. Let's buy those ahead of time. And they'll just end up sitting there. So this team at Acme Corp realized they made a big mistake. They realized they had to make some drastic changes. Stakes were too high. So they made some changes, and they really focused around 2 things. So the first was a new process. They totally changed the way that they ran the RI buying. And the second was identifying some new players to be involved in the process. So the process looked somewhat like this. At a very high level, they had a buy, measure, learn approach. You might recognize that from Agile methodology, kind of a spin-off of that. The idea is you iterate through the process. You make changes, you learn from them, you improve, you repeat that cycle. And they attached a number of steps that we'll go into more detail here in a minute. On the other side, they also introduced a new person. They introduced the RI czar. And the RI czar was essentially a person who was responsible for looking at the billing data each and every month to identify opportunities to increase reserved instance coverage. Now, this sounds really expensive, right? Like, how can I put somebody on this? I mean, I've got need people to run my business. This isn't something we can focus on. And that's kind of what happens, is that nobody really dedicates people to the RI process, and as a result, it just doesn't happen frequently enough at most companies. It happens quarterly. It happens every 6 months. It happens once a year as the infrastructure is moving wildly every day. So what we found with this type of role in the companies who implement this, that when they make it somebody's job, and that's the key thing, somebody needs to be measured on RI purchasing. And there's some great metrics we'll get into in a minute here that you can actually track that to see, are we making progress, and did the buys that we make actually improve our bill or reduce cost avoidance, if you will, reduce what we would have paid. And the math on this actually works out pretty well. Fonts are a little hosed there, sorry. But essentially, if you're spending a lot of money on EC2 and you do RI purchasing properly, you can save 30 to 60%. And if you're spending $1 million or more a year, and there's a lot of people at this conference who are spending $1 million a month, that can add up to some serious dollars. So there is actually a pretty good business case to maybe not make this a full-time person, although I know of companies that have 2 or 3 people who are dedicated to this, but at least make it one of somebody's primary objectives that they're focused on. The interesting thing here, I think, is the third point, which is that it's usually not somebody in the tech org. At the scaled companies who are purchasing thousands of RIs or running 7 figures a month of infrastructure, tens of thousands of instances, it's usually somebody who falls under like a finance, procurement, vendor management organization, but a very technically minded person in that group. Maybe they have a light CS background, something like that. The reason for that is, again, RIs are not technology, right? They're a billing construct, and specifically they're a rate. And if you go back to the data center world, there's going to be one group of people who decide, what do we need to buy for servers? What is our capacity need on the tech side? They've decided what that is, and another group of people is going to decide how to buy those. Do we want to finance them? Do we want to pay up front? How are we going to actually negotiate that purchase? Same thing with RIs. Your tech team is focused on reducing usage. How do we use less servers, less gigabytes, less dynamo, whatever it is. And this person, or the finance-related person, is going to be focused on how do we reduce the rate for those things that you're using. So before we get into detail on that three-step process, I wanted to go a little bit over the basics of RIs, so that especially for folks that haven't bought a lot of them, that we're all on the same page with it. So reservations have two basic parts. You get a cost savings. The main reason people buy RIs, they want to spend less for their hours. And then you also get a capacity reservation. And the capacity reservation says, if Amazon has a shortage of a certain type of instance in a certain type of region, you're going to get first dibs. It's not a guarantee, but it's kind of like the VIP line. You're going to be at the front of it. And reservations, again, are a coupon. So in a 31-day month, a reservation is going to give you 744 hourly coupons that can be applied each and every month. And you don't have to do the application yourself. Amazon every hour is looking to see, we've got this type of instance, I've got this coupon that matches it, let's apply it. Oh, we got another instance, no coupon, they're going to run on demand. But it happens every hour and it cycles through. And this is important to realize as you're doing planning, because you can't look at total instances for the month or total instances for the day or count of instances or anything to do with instance count. You need to look at the hours. How many of each type of instance were you running each hour, so you can figure out how many coupons you need in each hour. That's particularly important if you have lots of accounts, because that's aggregated together. You may have 30 or 40 or 100 accounts, all using different types of instances. They're going to count up to see how many reservations you need. And these are the things that make up a reservation. So you have an instance family, an R3, a C3, an M1. You have a size within that, an operating system. Again, note Linux and RHEL, different things. And then you have a term, 1 year or 3 year. Most people buy 1 year reservations. If you run the numbers, there's actually a great blog post on our website about this. Like the 3 year reservations actually generally are the best deal. There have been very few cases, I think ever. I think our marketing person is back there. There's never been a case where an RI in the data we ran actually was not, the 3 year wasn't the better savings rate. So don't be afraid of them. They're actually something to consider. A lot of Adobe said in their webinar, they're buying at scale. They buy mainly 3 year RIs. It's a good thing to consider. Then you have 3 different types. You've got no upfronts, partials, and all upfronts. And they're, again, just different ways to pay for the same thing. So a no upfront is sort of like signing a lease. You're saying, I'm going to use this type of instance for 12 months, but I don't have to pay anything initially. I'm just going to kind of pay as I go. The partials are sort of like buying a house with a mortgage. You have like a big down payment, and then you have a reduced rate, but you keep paying something every month. And then the all upfronts are sort of like paying cash. You're going to pay the entire 12 or 36 months in one payment. Again, though, because that's all coming as one chunk and it all hits your DBR, your detailed billing report file, the one-time purchase, you do lose this special line item that shows up for the other two. It's called the injected line item that basically says how many hours you have or haven't used within that month for that type. So the all upfronts are the biggest savings. But you'll notice the savings is, in this case, 1.3% different. And that's pretty common. The all upfronts generally have a 1% to 2% higher savings rate. So not a big amount of additional savings for the cash outlay. The interesting thing about all 3, and this is, I think, changed at the beginning of this year, is that all 3 are a commitment to pay for full utilization. Whether or not you use the RI hours, you're going to pay for them. In the case of Acme Corp, 7 figures out, paid for it all, RIs were never applied, dollars still stay on the table. So because of that, it's really important to think of your reservations and your infrastructure as sort of 2 sides to the same coin. Your infrastructure on one side is going to be changing all the time, ideally, right? You've got auto-scaling happening, ideally. You've got instances being resized. You've got things that are changing your infrastructure based on the load, based on the need. And that's happening every hour, sometimes every 5 minutes. On the other side, you need reservations to keep up with that through that process. One last piece on the level setting around RI basics before we dig into the process, and this is something that I think catches up a lot of people in terms of where to put the RIs. There's a thing called Eye Affinity that exists between linked accounts. And if you have an account structure where you've got multiple accounts at Amazon, consolidated billing, you generally have something like this. You've got a master payer at the top, and the master payer, all the basically charges for the others flow up to that master payer, and you've got linked accounts associated. So you can buy RIs at either place. And you get, again, a cost savings and a capacity reservation, regardless of where you put it. But let's say you bought in the master payer and no instance was running in the master payer that could use that instance, or that could use that coupon, that RI coupon. The cost savings is going to flow out to the other linked accounts. It'll first try to apply to the account in which the reservation was purchased. If it can't, it'll go elsewhere. Same thing on the linked accounts. You buy the RI in a linked account. It'll try to apply it there first. If it can't, it'll then flow out to the other accounts to try and find a match, assuming there is one. So getting into this process here, there's sort of 3 steps we do along the way. So buy is pretty obvious. You're going to make a purchase. Measure, you're basically looking at ROI. In the learning stage, you're going to align your reservations to the portfolio. The key here is to minimize the time through this loop. Looking at that coin metaphor where you got the infrastructure on one side, reservations on the other, your infrastructure is all over the place. Ideally, it's moving quickly. You're adjusting to demand. You're adjusting to the right type of resources for the right type of things you're doing. You want to make sure this process goes quickly. So we're going to talk about some ways to do that. The metrics you're going to look at pretty much every stage of this process are 2 things we like to call the green line and the red line. So the green line is basically the percentage of hours within a period that are covered by reservations. So if you have 100 hours running, 10 of them are covered by reservations, 10% coverage, basically. Red line is the amount of unused but paid for, because every RI hour every month is paid for, hours. That one's obviously really important. You want to make sure you're not wasting the dollars you've spent. So basic green line looks like this. This is kind of a default one out of a Cloudability dashboard. You can lay a bunch of other stuff on it if you want. But the basic premise here is the top line is your total amount of hours, in this case on demand, and the bottom is reservation. So how much of it is running under a reservation. So we're going to come back to this one a lot. And then, in addition to this, you generally want to calculate a reserved utilization or a reserved coverage rate. What's our percentage? Great way to measure people. If you have somebody looking at this, how are they tracking against your goals? How is the coverage rate going up or down? And then there's a red line. You guys will all probably notice there is no red in this graph. I apologize, badly named. It's a good meme, though. So the red line, basically, in this example, is showing month over month the comparison between our total RI hours that we paid for versus how many we didn't use. So the tall blue lines are total hours, and the shorter bluish green lines are unused, the cost of those unused hours. So in this example, we'll see that back in January, we had very little unused hours. February, none. March, we had a little more. April, more. Something happened. Nobody paid attention. And now in the current month, we're tracking, and this was when this was taken, the current month, they were tracking to still have that same amount unused. So using those 2 metrics, let's look at the first part of the process, the purchase process. First and foremost, with purchasing, you want to walk before you run. It takes a long time to really get to high coverage and do it with a lot of waste. There's a lot of areas you can get stuck. So highly recommend your first buy be small and uncontroversial. It's not a boil the oceans type of approach. If you boil the oceans, you'll probably end up spending more than you need to. So look for things that nobody's going to be surprised by. We are going to be running M3s and US East 1A. That seems obvious for a lot of folks. Not as much for others. So you also want to focus your budget on high confidence purchases. So specifically things that we know are on all the time and are going to continue to be on. Things that are running 100% of the time. Great place to start. Remember, there's a break-even point, so maybe 50% on, for instance. Buying something at 52%, it's probably not a great place to start because you're only going to save that much. Buying something at 100%, much more savings. So we want to start there. And tied to that, you want to focus on the highest savings, which isn't so much about the confidence. It's more about, I have a bunch of these, or this is an instance type where there's a really good discount on RIs. Some RIs you may only save 20-some%, some you save 50%. Let's find the low-hanging fruit first. So within Cloudability, if you're using this tool to dig in there, you'd basically want to start first looking at which account, right? Because the account really matters where you buy it. So we'd want to ideally plan at the master level because we want to aggregate together all the potential hours we have to purchase the fewest possible RIs to get the highest coverage. So we'd plan at that master level, although we could go into account by account if we wanted. And then we want to pick a date range. Key because you need to buy based on actual usage, not future usage. So the date range, there's actually some nuance here. If you have a highly elastic infrastructure or, let's say, quickly growing infrastructure, it's really up and to the right, you don't want to look over the last 3 months. You might want to look at the last week because that's going to be most representative of now going forward. Whereas if you've got kind of up and down and it's pretty stable, you might want to look at a 2-month range. Timing is really key, though. This will drastically affect what you're recommended to buy, modify, and everything else. And then you're going to get into what we looked at earlier, those classes of instances. We're going to buy an i2 extra large US East 1A Linux, and we're going to then look for it, the lowest hanging fruit, right? So we want to find, in this case, sorted by the biggest savings. So the reservation purchases, single purchases, it'll save us the most amount of money. This one looks great. It'll save us 58%. And then taking that a step further, and this is actually a new feature. If anybody has used Cloudability in the past, this was just recently added. You can actually set a usage rate. So let's say I just want super high confidence, instances that are running all the time, that are going to be the most savings. 100%, let's start there. And then maybe the next month you dial it back to 90%, then you go to 80%. Again, things that you're really confident are going to stick around and you're going to have the most savings on. On the back of that, before you make the purchase, you'll also want to do this, which is confirm the math. There's a bunch of numbers up here. I'm not going to walk through each one, but it basically compares what you would pay on demand versus what you will save if you make the RI purchase. The two things I want to call out here in this recommendation, it's really important to look at as you're building these type of reports in our tool or anywhere else, is you want to see what percentage of the hours are the instances running, and you want to compare that to break even. So in this case, it's 99%. And the break even is only 41%. So that's a really high confidence purchase. If we make this purchase, we're going to make a lot of money back if things continue as they are. The other thing that's really interesting, I think, to start looking at is the cash flow comparison, which is basically saying, in this example, at about month 5, we're going to break even. We're going to start saving money on that. So if we're really confident that this project is going at least the next 9 months, it's probably a really good buy to make. So once we made that first small, uncontroversial purchase, we want to loop back into the measurement process. And this generally happens, and Acme Corp is running this process now monthly, where they have a big team that comes together to look at this once a month, and they're going to come back and see, how did we do? So we're going to go back to that green line. Now, if we made an RI purchase that was effective, green line should go up. All things being equal, same amount of hours, green line increases. We also want to dig back into that red line. So in this case, we want to dig a little deeper, not just the total cost, but we want to get into what specific types of instances. It's a very high level. We're just looking at instance type here. We want to get deeper into the AZ, the OS, all of that. We want to start digging into what we're not wasting so we can get into strategies for how to start using that waste, which I'll get to here in just a minute. You may, though, run into this, if I can click. Wait a minute. Last month, we did all the work, we made a good RI buy, and our bill didn't go down. What happened? And this happened with our friends at Acme Corp, where the month after they started the new process, they did tons of work, tons of analysis, everybody's got signed on, looks good, made the buy, the bill went up significantly the next month. They were a little concerned, obviously. And the thing that they had to remember, and we started to dig in on, was that an effective RI rate or purchase drives the hourly rates down. But if you increase your usage really dramatically over that time, it's going to overshadow the savings. This seems kind of obvious when you think about it. If I use more, the rate's going to get overtaken. But it's hard to explain that to your VP all the time after a purchase. So really good to keep that in mind. You've got usage, which affects your ultimate bill, and you've got the rate, which affects your ultimate bill. They are very different things, and we want to measure them separately. So the way we can measure a rate, what we built for these guys after that purchase, and this is a very in-depth report with a bunch of filters, but it basically says we're just looking at a certain instance type in a certain region in a certain operating system, and that was the one we bought. We bought these RIs. And we're comparing there on the top right 2 date ranges. The date range is before the purchase versus after the purchase. And we basically can see that even though they use 6% more on the left here, the usage hours during that period, hours of that type, their spending actually dropped by 26%. So we pulled this report together. We saved a bunch of these for their RI purchases, and they were able to go then to their VP and say, look, this purchase, even though our total bill went up, was actually really effective. We should make more of these. So we figured out after the buy, we did some measurement. We see what's happening. Things went up in the green line. Hopefully the red line is not too big. We want to then start taking actions to adjust our next purchase and adjust our previous purchases to be more effective. So the first and probably the most important action, in my opinion, this is like the most powerful and also simple thing you can do to save money on Amazon, which is make RI modifications. Anybody making RI modifications today? Cool, a few people, great. Everybody who put their hand up saying they'd bought RIs should be putting their hand up for that one too. Because RIs or modifications are free. You can make them as many times as you want. There's no limit to them, and they basically let you start using the wasted hours that are unusable because they're the wrong instance size or in the wrong AZ on the on-demand hours you're running, and make sure you're actually saving money on those. So the way they work is you can modify within a family, which basically means that if you bought M3s and you bought 2 extra large, there's a point system attached. So a 2 extra large is 16 points. You can actually split that into 2 single extra larges, which are each worth 8 points, add up to 16 points. If you look at the Amazon pricing, every basically size, small, medium, large, it's a doubling in every case. So you can see how this starts to trickle down. Extra larges can go to larges can go to mediums, to smalls, and so on and so forth. These also go back the other way. You can take 2 smalls and make them a medium, 2 mediums, make them a large. This really de-risks purchasing within a family. If you're committed to M3, you know you're going to be using a bunch of M3, you don't have to know as much which size you're going to be using to make the RI buy confidently. You just need to know the family. The other way you can modify is within a region. So if you buy RIs in US East 1A, you can then modify into 1B, 1C, or 1D. You can't, however, modify into US East 2A or into West or another region entirely. It's just within the number there, so 1 ABC, 2 ABC, et cetera. So if you're using Cloudability, within there, there's going to be a little button right at the top that says, let's do modifications before we do purchases, which is kind of the way you want to do it. Because if you've got things you can modify, you've already paid for them, let's make sure we're using them before we buy more. So if you click that button, you're going to see a list of recommendations that look like this. On the left side, with just the 2 rows, we basically have RIs that we own that we're not really fully utilizing. They're being unused. On the other side, we have instances that are running on demand that we could modify our RI that we own into. So in the first one, C3 extra large could be split into additional C3 extra larges in different AZs, and let's put a 2XL in there as well. The next one, we're going to do a similar thing, move them to different AZs and combine one together. And again, these are free. You can make these changes. It's literally 5 or 6 clicks in the Amazon console. Doesn't require an engineer, doesn't require anybody with training or certification. You can just log in and make the changes. So the reason that these really are impactful, aside the fact that they're free and easy and all that, is that the savings is twofold, right? So on the left side, you've got unused RIs. In this case, this single one is costing $744 a month. Each and every month, you're being charged for that. On the other side, you've got all these on-demand charges that are running that don't have to be. So this single modification could save up to $2,800 a month with 6 clicks by anybody with access to the Amazon billing console. So very powerful stuff and very easy. You want to look for opportunities as you're making your RI purchases to increase modification opportunities. Modifications make RI purchasing a lot less risky, and there's some ways you can ensure that they can happen more often in the future. So when you're doing planning, and again, this is a filter in Cloudability, you can build it in different ways you want, but this one is looking at basically all of our R3 types, because we can move small, extra large, all that within there, and then also within US West 2 as well, because we can go ABC, and then just at REL. Can't change the OS. Everything within this type of list is going to be much safer buy because it's interchangeable. You can move it around. So you want to start kind of dialing back and saying, I know you buy RIs for the AZ, and I know you buy them for a specific type, but let's think about our planning process as a grouping. Let's look for the ones that have the most flexibility down the road in order to reduce risk when we buy. And that's the basic process. There's a lot more small fine-tuning steps in there, but at a high level, that's what you want to go through. You want to minimize the time through the loop and also repeat it as often as possible. So when we started talking about RIs at, what was the first RI talk we did? 2013 at reInvent. Everybody was just kind of buying yearly or not at all. And that was okay because people weren't as big as they are now and they weren't moving things around as much. But really what you want to get into is ideally a monthly process or better. We know companies that do this weekly. We've seen companies do multiple purchases and modifications in a week. Monthly's probably fine for you if you're not extremely elastic. But the process generally looks something like this, where first you're going to do modifications. Easy to do, want to get those out of the way. Then you're going to pull in the recommendations from our tool to basically say, what should we buy now that we've made the modifications? Have a day or two to confer with the various stakeholders, both on the tech and business side, to confirm that these purchases make sense, and then make the purchase. Actually, let me go back there. This schedule obviously can be any day of the month. I do recommend picking a day, picking a period, getting it on the calendar, because it's, as anybody who's bought RIs has probably found, it's really hard to remember to do it frequently enough. You're worried about keeping your infrastructure up. You're worried about, if you don't buy RIs, nothing bad happens. Nothing falls over. But next month, the bill is higher than it needs to be. So scheduling this out is really important. And in the process, this is kind of how it's broken down and how Acme Corp, who we talked about earlier, does this. So they have their RI czar. And the RI czar is basically making those modifications on a regular basis and pulling in the recommendations, doing the initial analysis, pulling the data out of Cloudability, looking at Amazon, figuring out the initial recommendations. Then there's a center of excellence, a COE, like a cloud COE team that meets every month on a scheduled time frame that's cross-functional. It includes finance representatives, it includes some product business owners, it includes folks from the tech org. They all get together to review the recommendations and also look at the efficacy of past purchases, because you want to bring everybody along for the ride. You may have a month where you buy a bunch of RIs and the bill does not go down. And it's really hard to back all this learning into everybody else. And even, ideally you can get your VP or whoever's breathing down your neck on this to be along for the ride as well, because everybody's got to understand how this process works since they all have a hand in it. So as much as possible, getting the same people in the room is going to be handy. The tech team then is going to have a look at the recommendations to say, okay, you guys are saying that we want to spend $100,000 this month on RIs, R3s in US West 1. We have just decided to stop using R3s. We're not going to buy those, not buy those. Now that's distinct from we're going to start using R3s, let's go buy them. We do want to have the tech team say we're going to stop using these, let's not buy them, because we got to get to the break even. If they stop using them in 2 months, we haven't hit the break even, we've lost money. At that point then, everybody's agreed on what to buy. Somebody in some part of the business org, finance, procurement, vendor management, depending on the organization, needs to decide how they want to deploy their money. Again, do you want to pay all up front, a portion of it, or no up front? And then the same person, ideally each and every month, this RI czar, executes that buy and executes the modifications on an ongoing basis. And that's the process. So a few things to leave you guys with. After reInvent, RIs are frequently misunderstood. I've sat in the room with really smart, really technical people who run really big companies, and they don't understand how these work, and that's across the board a common thing. There's a lot of detail, there's a lot of nuance. Take time to educate everybody on your team on the fundamentals. Ton of talks from reInvent. We've done a couple years of them. There's a bunch of stuff on our blog, blog.cloudability.com. Learn the basics, get everybody trained up. It'll make your life easier down the road. RI coverage changes constantly. Your red line and green line, even if you have monthly meetings, are moving all over the place during the month. So even if you're not at a place where you can track that every day, every week, just start looking at that. Get those reports pulled up. Know where you stand. So if you come back the next month, you can tell if you've done better or worse, at least. Again, modifications, powerful and free. Getting started with those, highly recommend them. They are the easiest way to save money on Amazon without touching your infrastructure. And it's really easy to get distracted. RIs are not on the top of most people's mind. Get somebody in place whose job it is. Make sure that's scheduled out, ideally those monthly meetings, well in advance, and get all the stakeholders there. And then start working iteratively. You want to make small, uncontroversial purchases with those future modifications in mind, right? So what can we buy now that's safe and that later we can modify? And finally, because it's been a long week and we're in Vegas, drink lots of water, please.